From a moral and ethical standpoint, January 22nd, 1973 is one of the most significant dates in the history of the United States of America. On this date, the United States became less united, and a culture war began that still rages. The culture war began when the United States Supreme Court handed down two landmark decisions that declared abortion a fundamental right, and abortion on demand for any reason throughout the entire 9 months of a woman's pregnancy became the law of the land. We come to one of the more controversial chapters in our textbook, Chapter 11, which deals with abortion. As is often the case, we begin with some definitions of key terms. The term abortion. Abortion is the premature termination of a pregnancy, termination prior to the birth of a baby. A spontaneous abortion is a miscarriage. An induced abortion is caused by the woman herself or by another, usually a medical doctor. Another term we need to define is the term zygote. A zygote is a group of cells that begin to form and grow immediately after the union of sperm and an egg, an event referred to as conception. Embryo. The term embryo refers to a developing human individual from the 2nd through the 7th week of gestation. Gestation is a technical term for pregnancy. Fetus. It's a Latin term that means little person, and it refers to the developing human individual from the 8th week of pregnancy until birth. Child or baby. The term child or baby, the authors say, is normally used after the fetus is born. I note that this term is used before the fetus is born if the woman is planning on keeping the baby. Have you ever heard an expectant mother who was looking forward to the birth of her baby refer to that which is growing within her as a fetus? They are constantly talking about the baby. They go to have ultrasound tests taken so they can see the baby. They're very interested in the development of the baby within their womb. And so it is not really correct that we don't begin to use the term baby until after a child is born. It's very unusual, in fact, for us to refer to the unborn as fetuses in anything other than a medical situation and environment. Conceptus. The authors of our textbook suggest that this would be a better term than either fetus or baby. It's a term that has been coined by an ethicist by the name of Daniel Callahan, and it means that which has been conceived. The author suggests this is a useful term because it's neutral, and it can be used to refer to a developing human individual from conception until birth, and thus avoid the emotional overtones given to other terms used by both sides of the abortion debate. Well, I'm not sure that the term fetus carries emotional overtones. Certainly the term baby does. And while the euphemism conceptus may be useful in our discussion, and we may use that from time to time as I continue this lecture, it's hard for me to imagine that expectant mothers anticipating the birth of their baby are going to begin to call it their conceptus. Euphemisms are terms we use when we are uncomfortable with a subject. And whether you call an unborn developing human being a fetus, or whether you call it a conceptus, The use of the euphemisms are intended to avoid the painful emotional overtones that I personally think need to be there when we are considering a subject as important as abortion. But if you prefer using a euphemism such as conceptus, be my guest, and I will use it from time to time throughout the rest of this lecture. Let's talk about some other terms not addressed in our textbook. The term mother, pregnant woman. How should we refer to a woman carrying a conceptus? The authors have suggested that we use the term conceptus to avoid the many emotional overtones given to other terms used by both sides of the abortion issue. But it's hard to imagine a term that carries more emotional baggage than the term mother. And since we're going to use neutral euphemisms to avoid strong emotional overtones, shouldn't we find a more neutral term than mother, something that would be less cumbersome than constantly referring to the woman carrying a conceptus as a pregnant woman? There's another Latin term, gravida. It means a pregnant woman. So fetus is a Latin term, conceptus is a Latin term. Should we then, to avoid emotional baggage, use gravida when referring to the woman carrying a conceptus? You see what we get into once we start using euphemisms to avoid the emotion connected with moral issues. When we are talking about moral issues, we are talking about things that are important. And as has been pointed out in our discussions of intuitionism, there is an emotional aspect to morality. The authors acknowledge this. And can we really separate emotion from an issue such as abortion? Well, we haven't been able to do so since 1973, and I'm very doubtful whether the use of Latin euphemisms are going to accomplish that purpose. This is an emotionally charged issue, no matter what side of the fence you happen to be on, or if you're in the middle of the fence somewhere. Abortion is an emotionally charged issue. Viability is another important term you need to be aware of. It's a term that is important in a discussion of abortion, particularly abortion as it is legally allowed in the United States of America. Viability occurs somewhere between the 26th and 28th week of gestation. Remember, gestation is a medical term for pregnancy. And because of improvements in medical technology, viability can occur somewhat earlier now. Viability occurs when the conceptus is considered viable, thus viability. That means the conceptus is able to become a baby, according to our author's definition, because it can survive outside of the woman. And birth normally occurs in an ordinary pregnancy somewhere between the 39th and the 40th week of pregnancy. Some medical technologies you need to be aware of. The first is ultrasonic testing. This can be done early in a pregnancy, somewhere around the 12th week. An ultrasonic test can be performed on a woman at that time, and you can gain a lot of information from that test about the developing embryo or fetus or conceptus, or if you want to keep the thing, the baby. This particular procedure is performed through sound echo technology, and pictures of the developing human life can be seen. In some cases, these are used to announce that a baby's on the way. I've seen them hung on refrigerators. I've seen them in baby books. The first picture of that your parents have of you may be an ultrasound picture that they have in a scrapbook or a baby book. This is a non-invasive procedure, so it can continue to be performed throughout the pregnancy, and the test can be used to continue to gather information. Through ultrasound testing, parents can find out whether they're going to have a little boy or a little girl. They can see the developing fetus's beating heart. They can determine possible birth defects. But this is not a completely accurate test. And so if a doctor notices something that looks defective, the doctor may suggest that you move on and have another test performed, such as amniocentesis. And I pronounced that wrong. It's amniocentesis. I'm sorry, these Latin terms are really getting to me. Amniocentesis can be performed after the 16th week of pregnancy. In this test, a needle is inserted into the amniotic sac. This is where the conceptus is gestating, that means developing, and some of the amniotic fluid is withdrawn and tested, and information can be learned about the conceptus from this test. When this fluid is tested, you can confirm the sex of the baby. Sometimes parents are surprised because the early ultrasound was wrong. And they can also determine more certainly the presence of certain abnormalities. Now, this test factors into the abortion debate because at this point, many are choosing not to have the baby because they don't want a baby with Down syndromes, for example, or they don't want a baby that is going to be born with some deformity. Now, some deformities can be corrected through surgery performed before a baby is born, but some would not want to go through this and would choose to abort at this time and perhaps try again later. Another test that is used to determine whether the conceptus is defective is a chorionic villus sampling, CVS. CVS is something that can be performed early in the pregnancy, even before ultrasound, as early as the 9th week of pregnancy. In CVS, a flexible catheter is inserted vaginally, and it is then guided by ultrasound along the uterine walls. And then a gentle suction allows the catheter to extract fetal cells from thread-like projections on the chorion, which is the outermost skin layer on the developing embryo. These projections are villi, so it's chorionic villus sampling. The advantage of this procedure over amniocentesis, boy, I'm having trouble saying that today, is the fact that the results and diagnosis can be acquired much earlier, and this allows for an earlier abortion if the woman desires it. This would normally be performed if for some reason there is a strong suspicion that the fetus might be defective. This is performed primarily for women who want to know so that they can either prepare themselves. Let's say you have a woman that's very pro-life and she wants a test because she wants to know what she's going to be dealing with. Or the results of the tests can be used by a woman who is saying, and perhaps her husband with her, or the doctor, family, whoever, that if the fetus is, as we believe it to be, severely defective, we could go ahead and have an abortion at an early stage in this pregnancy, which is going to be much easier on the woman medically, if not emotionally. There's a disadvantage to this, though. Recent studies have shown that CVS may cause deformities. You go in to find out if you have a deformed fetus. The test comes back negative, and you're very excited. You know, you're going to have a healthy baby. The pregnancy continues, you have that baby, and it's not healthy at all. Its limbs are deformed. And the reason they're deformed is because these cells were taken from it at a very early stage in its development. And so there is this risk connected with CVS. When we're talking about the issue of abortion, the authors of our textbook suggest that we should be guided by a couple of principles. The first is, when does life begin? And connected with that, when should it be protected? Medically speaking, scientifically speaking, a human life begins at the moment of conception. If science was able to duplicate that, they would have the big press conference and say, hey, we've developed human life in a test tube. A major scientific breakthrough, perhaps the greatest breakthrough in the history of science. So it is a human life, and that life was conceived when the sperm and the egg met. But the question the authors raise is this: at what point should that developing life be protected? And the authors suggest that right now the abortion debate is being driven by the extremes. On the one hand, you have those who are extremely pro-life, and on the other hand, you have those who are extremely pro-choice, and they are driving the debate. And of course, there are spin-off moralities from each of these positions, and this issue lies at the very core of the culture war, and this is the issue that set that culture war in motion. Let's talk briefly about the history of abortion in America. The textbook is not complete in its analysis of this issue, so I'm going to fill in a few of the details. They say that in the year 1800, soon after the founding of our republic, abortion was tolerated. That is not completely true. Abortion happened. There was always this person in the village that had something you could drink that would cause you to miscarry, or if it had gone further than that, there was someone in the village that would perform a procedure. This was not something that was looked on as a virtuous thing. It was not tolerated in the sense that people were okay with it. People snuck around to do this. They didn't advertise it. These procedures were carried out under the cover of darkness in back rooms, and the passing of the potion was done secretly because it was considered irresponsible morally to terminate a pregnancy. Nevertheless, it was done, and there were not laws against it, so in that sense you could say it was tolerated. Within 100 years, abortion was banned in every state. Now, the idea a lot of people have, particularly as a result of modern feminism, is that this was because of those white males, those nasty white males that were trying to subordinate women and keep women under their thumb, chained to the stove with a chain just long enough to get to the bedroom. The fact is, the laws against abortion were passed in every state as a result of the activity of early feminism. The feminists of the 19th century were motivated by a Judeo-Christian ethic, and they viewed abortion as a crime against women perpetrated by men and by the pressures put on women by men. And so in the 19th century, though women did not have the right to vote, they became increasingly political, particularly in the last decades of the 19th century. You had movements such as the temperance movement, and I am in Kansas, perhaps you are as well as you're listening to this. There was a champion of the temperance movement, a violent temperance proponent by the name of Carrie Nation. I actually went to high school with her granddaughter. She went around with her axe, smashing up bars, and so women led the movement to ban alcohol that led to the 18th Amendment ultimately. And women were involved in other issues too, the right to vote and the right to get an education. Women wanted equality. And among the issues that those early feminists championed was bans on abortion, and they were so effective that abortion came to be banned in every state in the Union. I mention that because of the irony of it. The battle for abortion is going to be led by feminists. So the laws against abortion were put on the books because of the political agitation of women in the 19th century, but values had greatly changed, and by the 1970s, largely coming out of the countercultural revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, the mood had changed, and now the right to abortion was seen as a great victory in the movement for equality by the feminists of that time, that day and time, and that continues to be the case to this very day. Now, the authors mention the 1973 decision Roe versus Wade. This decision overturned the laws against abortion in every state in the Union. This was the decision, one of the decisions, that was handed down on the 22nd of January 1973. Not mentioned in our textbook is a decision that is equally important, Doe versus Bolton. And Doe versus Bolton made abortion on demand throughout the entire pregnancy, throughout all 9 months of the pregnancy, the law of the land. Now, Roe said that the right to abortion would be determined through a trimester approach, and we'll talk about that. But its companion decision extended the right to an abortion even further. The authors of our textbook pretty much ignore Bolton, and they state that the legal status of abortion in America is that abortions are allowed, permitted, without exception during the first trimester, and they can be restricted during the second trimester, and the implication is they can be outright banned during the third trimester. That is certainly what Roe says, but Bolton goes beyond this because it allows for an abortion throughout the entire 9 months of a pregnancy if a woman's health is endangered. And health is defined so broadly that mental health, depression, all you would need to have is a mental health professional sign off on the fact that you are having mental issues as a result of the pregnancy, and you can have an abortion on the during the 39th week of your pregnancy if you should so choose. As a matter of fact, according to the law as it now exists, no one is considered human and in right to legal protection until they are born, until they have exited the birth canal. And this has led to late-term abortions, and you've heard of late-term or partial birth abortions. These are abortions in which a fetus, a conceptus, is turned so that it is delivered breech. And the fetus is delivered except for the head. And the head it may be dealt with then by, they may puncture the skull and suck out the brain and then deliver the head. Or in the case of one late-term abortionist who was convicted of killing babies that slipped out of the birth canal and became babies. They ceased to be conceptus once they slip out of the birth canal, and he was killing them at that point in time, and he's serving a life-term prison sentence because of this. But his procedure was to deliver everything but the head and then slit the spinal cord, cut the spinal cord with a pair of scissors. He would have a small incision, insert the scissors, cut the spinal cord. That would kill the conceptus. The head could then be delivered. And the way these late-term clinics work, and there was a notorious one in Kansas. The man who operated this was assassinated by a pro-life, anti-abortion fanatic. He lived in Wichita, and Dr. Teller. And you have another one in Nebraska with Dr. Carhart, although I think he's retired, though his clinic goes on. You had one in Colorado, Dr. Hearn in Boulder, and they exist pretty much all over the country. And they work in concert with a mental health professional. A woman would go, says, I'm really having a rough time with this. They sign them off as under Bolton as having mental issues. The pregnancy is affecting their mental health. And then they go have the procedure performed. Usually this procedure costs a few $1,000s. During our last presidential campaign, this was brought up, and one of the presidential candidates said she was in favor of this procedure, as is, and that she was opposed to any efforts to restrict the right to an abortion throughout the entire 9 months of a pregnancy. So if we're going to talk about the legal status of abortion in the United States, discussing the Roe decision is not sufficient. The trimester approach is still used, and states have tried to pass regulations with varying degrees of success in regulating at least the third trimester, and some states have been successful in doing this. But there is that medical exception. And so that is a loophole that gives the United States the most liberal abortion policy in the world. The norm in Europe is that abortion is allowed legally during the first trimester for any reason, and after that it has to be the physical health of the mother. And so Europe has much more restrictive abortion laws than does the United States. Even in very liberal countries such as Sweden, you'll find that their abortion laws are much stricter, just as I described them. I was describing the Swedish system, and this would be true throughout the developing world. In the majority world, it's probably the way it was around 1800 in the United States. Okay, we've talked about the facts. Now we're going to look at the moral issues, and the big question we want to look at first is, when does human life begin? And this slide suggests that life is present from conception, and that is just scientifically true. The authors then add, but there may be a different point at which such life can be considered human. Well, scientifically speaking, that isn't true. It is a human life from the moment of conception. It's not a little elephant that's developing there in the woman's womb. It is a human life. Given time and nourishment, it's going to become a full-fledged human being. And that's what this slide is really talking about. At what point does that developing human life become a human being, worthy then of the protection that we naturally afford to all human beings in our culture and in every culture in the world? We have rights are human rights. At what point do we get them? A conceptus, scientifically speaking, passes through various stages of development, and the authors note that the closer it comes to viability, the more human it becomes. The authors say in the early stages of development, it's hard to say that that developing human life is fully human or that it is a human being. The authors also point out that after the 12th week, it's increasingly hard to say that it is not. Certainly what it always was, a human life, begins to be visually apparent. Here are some slides that show you what we mean. At 5 weeks, that developing human being doesn't look very human, does it? You can see what will become hands and fingers, and you can see little stubs that are going to become feet, but it doesn't look human at all. But 14 weeks into the pregnancy, it's beginning to look very human. The heart is beating. You're beginning to get brain waves. Something is going on. I've always wondered, what in the world are they thinking? We know they dream in there. We know they hear in there. What's going on in their little developing minds? Who knows? But something's happening. And then by the 20th week of the pregnancy, you can see that this is a little girl. And she is looking very much like a member of the human family. At what point does this developing human life become a human being? According to law in the United States as it now exists, not until it exits the birth canal. As you think about those pictures, you can understand why there is so much emotion connected with this particular debate. The arguments against abortion are well known, but we're going to briefly review them here, and then we'll talk about the arguments for abortion. And again, I'm dispensing with some euphemisms. Those who are against abortion prefer to be called pro-life. In fact, they're against abortion. And those who call themselves pro-choice are really for abortion. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about life, period. Who isn't for life, you know? And we're not talking about choice per se. Who isn't for choices? So long as those choices are morally appropriate. And that's really the issue, isn't it? And that's what we're going to be talking about. The arguments against abortion. The first argument we want to consider is the genetic argument. This argument states that a person's genetic makeup is established at conception. Now, there is no argument here. This is true. Scientifically, it is so. At the moment of conception, the genetic code is planted within that cell that is formed. And based on that genetic map, the conceptus begins to develop. What you are genetically today was determined at the moment of your conception. And so the argument is, at that moment, a unique human individual was created. And that unique human being continues to exist from the point of conception onward. And therefore, that human life must be valued. So that is the genetic argument. Now the problem is people do not agree when human life actually begins. And that is what the author says. It's not true. We know when it begins scientifically. The question is not when life begins, but at what point that life is valued to the point that it receives the full range of human rights that we grant to members of the human species. There is a prominent ethicist, I believe he's at Princeton, Sanger. He argues that we shouldn't be declared human till 3 days after birth, after we have had a full range of genetic tests run to determine whether or not we are worthy of participation in the human family. He is a very popular ethicist, though his belief may sound unethical to you. The authors would point out that this is a religious argument because it involves that idea of a soul. At what point does a person receive the human soul? If we are not determinists, if we believe we have a free will, that is something that is connected to a human soul. And so at what point do we receive that? The pro-life person would say we receive it at the moment of conception, and thus human life has a sacred aspect to it, and so it must be revered and protected and granted rights. Now, the counter-argument to that would be, well, wait a minute. It may be a human life, but this soul stuff is religious stuff, and we are not living in a religious state. We are living in a state where there is a separation between church and state. And the real question is whether there is a soul. And, do we have to accept your view that there is? And isn't the real issue society here? When should society decide that this developing human life is worthy of protection? And the pro-life side would come back and say, well, assuming you're right that we can't tell, maybe we ought to err on the side of caution and be sure that we don't act immorally or irreverently towards a human life, especially since that human life is innocent. If there is a God, that's probably not going to make him happy with you. And so the debate goes back and forth. It's a genetic argument. Related to this is the sanctity of life argument. This is an argument that is certainly based on religious values. The very word sanctity is part of a word group that includes sanctification or holiness, something that is of sacred values. And the word sacred would be part of this word group. And it is the idea that human life is sacred. And an innocent child, how sacred is that? I think this is something that is generally accepted as a cultural norm, even if people are not religious. There's something religious. There's something about that innocent child, and we value their innocence. And so child abuse, to abuse a little child, we look at that with a special kind of horror, because we recognize that even those who would not necessarily buy into this idea of holiness would nevertheless be a little inconsistent in this, because they would kind of put that child in a sacred category. They're a little special. We don't treat them the way we would treat those who are older. The pro-life argument would say, when do we begin to treat these little children that way? I mean, most of us, let's face it, there may be someone whose moral view is if someone wants to abuse their baby, that's fine with me. Let's take the most extreme example I can think of, a case of abuse I heard of that still turns my stomach. Someone put their baby in a microwave. Some drunk, he wasn't drunk, he's on drugs, dad did that, or stepdad did that to an innocent baby. Most of you have probably had a real lurching of the inner elephant as you heard me describe that horrendous crime. And certainly we feel that way because we have this intuitive sense, if you will, that there is something special about the innocence of that baby, the helplessness of that baby. So we kind of buy into this idea of sanctity, sacredness. But our law says that a developing human life does not acquire that until after it has fully exited the birth canal. So the argument for sanctity would say, why? Is that unborn child less sacred 5 minutes before she exits the birth canal? Would you protect that child then? Well, how about 10 minutes? How about 24 hours? How about the week before full gestation? How about a month before? At what point do you draw the line and say this is no longer sacred? It's no longer worthy of protection. And why? So that's the sanctity of life argument. The implications of the sanctity of life argument are these. It overwrites, sacredness overwrites conflicting rights that might come into conflict with the sacred thing, whatever it is. So you have a woman say, I have a right as a human being to determine the course of my life, my own procreative life. I should have the right to decide whether or not I am going to have this baby or not. And so you have a conflict between this idea of the sacredness of human life, in the case of the pro-life argument, the unborn, and the sacred right of this woman to decide for herself what is appropriate. And if her pregnancy is complicated in some way, should she not have the right then to override this concept of sacredness? Well, technically speaking, nothing overrides sacredness. No right is greater than that. You have a temple sitting on a site that is set on for 1,000 years in India, and someone wants to tear it down and build a shopping center. The people of India would be understandably outraged. No, the sacred takes precedence over the commercial interests of those who would want to put a shopping center up. So, historically speaking, just on the basis of the term, sanctity is the highest value of all. It overrides all other life. And so, if someone accepts the idea that life is sacred from the moment of conception onward, you are automatically saying any right the woman has is subordinate to the sanctity of that developing life, with the possible exception of self-defense. For example, a tubular pregnancy is not going to, that which is developing is not going to live, and neither will the woman carrying it. And though there are some who would say that's tough, most would say you try to save both, but in point of fact, you can only save one life in such a situation. Both the life of the woman and the child are sacred. And there is, as we talked about in murder, this right to protect yourself that most would grant. Another argument is one that we've talked about before, the domino argument, that once you accept the morality of abortion, you are going to accept a morality that is going to lead to the taking of other life as a matter of course. How about that child that is already born with a birth defect? We're seeing this acted out in the news as I make this recording. Right now in Great Britain, there is a little boy fighting for his life, a newborn, that's born with a birth defect that can be treated. And the parents have raised the money to bring that child to America. Hospitals in America have offered their services for experimental treatments that may save this child's life and allow the child then to grow and have a normal life. The government of Great Britain is not allowing the parents to bring the child to the United States. They are saying that the child has a duty to die, that the parents have a duty to let the child die. That is the way it is there. The National Health Service doesn't pay for experimental procedures or procedures that would save this child's life. And you would say, well, why do they object? The parents have their own money. Money's been raised. The Vatican wants the little kid. Bring him to the Vatican hospital. We'll help him. Hospital in the United States have said they'd take him. Why not? Well, the argument that the Vatican would make is that, you see, this is that culture of death we warn you about. The logic of abortion doesn't end at the womb. And society will continually allow more and more taking of life for more and more reasons, because once society decides that it has a right to decide who lives and who dies, what lives are worth protecting and what lives are not, society doesn't know when to quit with the killing. So that's the domino argument. Now, those who make the domino argument contend that this slippery slope will continue. To change the metaphor back to dominoes, the dominoes will continue to fall. And as they do, society will become desensitized to killing. And this will lead to the creation of what Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict referred to as a culture of death. You say, well, that's absurd. Well, think about it. Do you think right now, if gladiatorial combat became legal, that there would not be people who would go out to see people fight to the death? What do you think? That'd be a good question for a discussion board, wouldn't it? Maybe I will use that one sometime. The domino argument would say societies have come to that point before, and we should avoid the arrogance of thinking that we will not end up at the same destination if we continue to walk down the same path. Another argument is the medical argument, that abortion is an invasive procedure and therefore potentially dangerous. Now, it's argued that abortions are now safe because they are legal. And yet this is not completely true. I mentioned earlier an abortionist who is serving a life sentence because he was killing babies that had exited the birth canal, so technically they are babies at that point, and he had snipped their spinal cords after they had exited the womb. And he's also serving this sentence in part because of manslaughter. He performed a procedure on a woman and it led to her death. And there are complications to abortions, including the fact that a woman might not be able to have children again. So whatever the medical procedure is, there is a potential danger there. We'll look at the counter argument to that when we get to the pro-choice side of the ledger. But if you're talking about mental or a woman's health, an abortion is an interruption of a normal biological process and function, and it can have unintended consequences. Psychological danger. This argument states that abortion is psychologically destructive to the woman. She can use all the euphemisms she wants, but she lives with the fact that she has killed her baby, the argument goes, and many women struggle with this for the rest of their lives. The reason for this is a woman has to live with the guilt. The physical scars heal. The emotional scars remain. And how do you get rid of them? Kind of the Lady Macbeth thing. You got the blood on your hands. Out, out, damn spot. But the spot remains. But what about the argument that a woman going through a unwanted pregnancy may be suffering all sorts of psychological problems? The psychological argument would say, well, a woman who chooses to complete her pregnancy may require some psychological adjustment, but that is going to be a lot easier than living with the guilt resulting from her abortion. Another argument used by pro-lifers is that there are alternatives. A woman is pregnant, she doesn't want to have this baby. Well, there are any number of fine, reputable agencies that can place that unwanted child with, in homes where that child will be loved and cared for. This is sometimes referred to as the adoption option. You don't have to abort your baby, have the baby, and then let someone else who's desperate for a child have the blessing that you don't choose to have for yourself. Some would say, but I'm a poor person. How am I going to even afford this pregnancy? How can I, if I keep the child, afford to raise the child? Well, the pro-lifers would say, and I meant to say the anti-abortionists would say, I wanted to be not being quite consistent here. I'll do the same when I get to the pro-choice side of the ledger. But they would say that the financial argument is not really valid because there are agencies out there that will help. In our society, we also have welfare and Medicaid, in addition to private charitable organizations, and they can give financial assistance to the woman, whether she is married or not. She can afford to have the baby, and there is assistance so that she can raise the baby if she chooses to keep it. Besides, the anti-abortion advocate would say, when we're talking about an innocent unborn human life, economic considerations cannot come first. If we grant the argument that the unborn are children, if the unborn baby is a baby, you would argue like this. Would you say it's okay to kill your 1-year-old because you cannot afford her anymore? Well, you'd obviously say, no, that's absurd. That's absurd. How about this? Would you kill your newborn baby because as you're there in the hospital and you're holding the baby and nursing it, you realize I can't afford this baby? Would you kill it? And obviously that would be absurd. And they would say, then why is it absurd to say that you would kill it 2 weeks before, or a month before, or 2 months before, or so forth? So that's the argument. Now, another argument made by people such as Judge Judy would argue that if you're financially overburdened, you should be more judicious about having children. So maybe the decision about whether or not you were going to have the baby should have been made before you became pregnant. Just another thought, a little bit cynical, but an argument that is indeed made. Related to this is the idea that you need to take responsibility. It isn't that unborn baby's fault that you are in this mess. You need to take responsibility. You were sexually active. You should have known that that can result in a pregnancy. Why didn't you use contraceptives? And if the contraceptives fell, or if you didn't use them, didn't you know that that can result in a pregnancy? And if it does, whose fault is that? Take responsibility for your sexual activity and live with the consequences of the choice you made to be sexually active. That's where your choice should have been made. So you're making an irresponsible choice now because you were irresponsible in your choices earlier. Now, this is the big one that those who are on the pro-life side of the ledger have to wrestle with and answer. What about that baby that is conceived not as a result of any irresponsibility on the part of the parent, but as a result of rape or incest? Well, the the anti-abortion side of this argument will say that that is fortunately rare. How rare? Well, if all of the rapes reported in the first 10 years, the first decade out after Roe v. Wade, if all of them had resulted in a pregnancy, that would not add up to the number of abortions that were performed in the first year after Roe v. Wade. It happens, and that's the problem that the anti-abortion people have to face. It does happen. Incest rarer still? I don't know. But in any case, they argue it's still a baby and should not be punished for the crime of someone else. You know, in my function as a pastor, I have known women who were raped and chose to carry their babies to term. And, you know, I remember one case in particular, a woman was so afraid that the baby would look like her rapist and she'd have to live with that. Instead, the little baby was a spitting image of the mother. Happy ending. It was her pride and joy. Is it always a happy ending? I don't think so. How about adoption? Okay, you're still carrying the baby. So there's an amazing emotional power with this argument. It is true that pregnancies under these conditions are rare, and if there was an exception in the law that would allow for abortion in these cases, you would still be banning almost all abortions. But there is an emotional power to this argument that sometimes makes the anti-abortion side of the debate seem very insensitive. Well, let's look at the arguments for abortion. First argument we want to look at is a rights argument. This is based on our author's freedom principle, that people have a right to make their own moral choices, and they should not in any way be censored or judged for the choices they make. This argument says a woman has a right over her body, and this position then gives birth to several arguments, no pun intended. Simply stated, a woman ought to be allowed to have an abortion regardless of the reason if she requests it. Period. Hard stop. That's the argument. This is, of course, based on the idea that a woman has a right over her own body. Based on the freedom principle, she should not be judged. She should not suffer recrimination. She should not feel guilt or restrictions, legal or otherwise. Okay, how do you keep people from feeling guilt? I don't know how you do that. Even if no one is judging her, she may still have guilt. So I don't know that you can legislate that. I don't think you can put that in your moral code. People have guilt. For whatever reasons, they have guilt. But the argument is there should be no restrictions, legal or otherwise. This was a position advocated during our last election cycle by the Democratic nominee. The central point of this argument is that a woman ought to have right over her body like a man, including her reproductive rights. And we'll talk about human sexuality in a future lecture, but The key here is that with the sexual revolution, uh, everyone got the idea, and it still exists today, that maybe the best thing about sex is its recreational uh, uses. And men have been going around enjoying their sexuality for years. They have not had to worry about the consequence of an unwanted pregnancy, although there is such a thing as a shotgun wedding. But the idea is that men have been able to be sexually active with very few consequences. Women, on the other hand, have always had that fear of pregnancy, which has restricted the full exploration of their sexual possibilities. So the idea is abortion is needed as a safeguard in case the contraceptive fails. And not to have this is restricting women in a way that men are not restrained. Now, the authors write, in the past, women, because of an accident of nature, the fact that they are the ones who become pregnant, have not shared in these equal rights. But now with birth control, it's possible, and women no longer have to worry about that accident of nature. It's an interesting way of putting that, an accident of nature. It's a good thing for that accident, I suppose, or none of us would be here. Somebody has to have the babies. Biologically, that would, in mammals, that would be the female. Is being a woman an accident of nature? Is having the ability to have a baby an accident of nature? Seems like an odd way of putting it. From my perspective, maybe you would disagree. The rights that a woman must have, according to the pro-choice argument, is that a woman has the right to an abortion. It is just another method of birth control that's used when the other methods fail or when they're not used. So the argument for abortion is based on rights, particularly sexual rights, not in the sense of, well, yes, in the sense of reproduction. My sexual rights would include the right to reproduce only when and if I would choose to do so. To carry this argument one step further, any conceptus, then, that occurs as a result of a woman exercising her sexual freedom is a part of the woman's body until it is born, or as the law states, until it leaves the birth canal. Therefore, since it's part of a woman's body, she has the absolute say over whether it should continue to live or whether it should be allowed to be born. So that is the argument. Again, it is based completely on the author's freedom principle, that everyone has a right to choose their own course in life. For a woman, she should have the right to control her sexuality, to participate as men do in the full panoply of sexual pleasures that are out there to enjoy. And her reproductive capacity should be something that she has control over, to the point that even if an unwanted pregnancy occurs, she should have the absolute right to terminate it. The argument would go, enforced maternity should not take place. What are you going to do? This woman doesn't want to have the baby. Are you going to force her to have the baby anyway? What kind of a police state is that? And the argument continues, no one should be forced or even urged to go through a pregnancy against her will. It's no one else's choice. She and she alone have the right to decide her future. This argument would argue that birth is the beginning of human life. And again, human life medically, scientifically begins at the moment of conception. But this matter we've been talking about, at what time does that human life developing within the womb become a human being? And the argument made by the pro-choice side of the debate is not until it's born. As long as it's within the woman, it is part of the woman, and it is subject to her decision as to whether it's carried to term or not. Period. Hard stop. Now, this is Jimmy Carter's argument. You probably are too young to remember President Jimmy Carter, but he was an advocate of the pro-choice side of the debate, and his argument is every child should be a wanted child. And the argument was we now have methods of birth control, including abortion. And it's interesting that the authors would including abortion as a method of birth control. But the point of it is that we now live in an era where every child born into the world can be thoroughly wanted by the parents. And the argument is this will decrease child abuse and will keep the population level where it needs to be, prevent children from being raised in poverty and so forth. So this is a utilitarian argument. It will be in the best interest of everyone concerned and of the culture as a whole to have the abortion on demand policies that we currently have in the United States. Related to this is the idea that with modern birth control, people can limit the size of their family. There's a better quality of life for themselves and for their children. This is an interesting argument. The pro-choice side of the debate here takes the responsibility argument and turns it on its head. And they would say that a woman who is terminating her pregnancy so that she will not be a burden to society is acting responsibly. She is the one who created what could potentially be an expensive problem for society. And so she is doing the responsible thing by ending her pregnancy. How about that adoption argument? Well, this side of the debate would say maybe she doesn't want to put up her child for adoption. Maybe she doesn't want to live with the thought that somewhere in the world is this child. And besides, she's still going to have to go through 9 months of pregnancy. It's going to hamper her freedom and her life a great deal. And adoption is not necessarily the panacea that it is made out to be. A lot of children, when they find out they're adopted, go through physical and psychological problems. They wouldn't have to gone through those problems had they been aborted. And you have no guarantee that the home that they're placed in is going to be a good situation for them. Pro-lifers always assume it is going to be, and everyone's going to live happily ever after. But how do you know it's going to be a good home? How do you know that that child is not going to feel rejected? Maybe there's other children, and that child is going to be the one on the outside. You don't know that adoption is going to be good for that child. Those on the pro-life side assume that. But that is not necessarily the case. Talk to some adoptive children. Not all of them have had good lives. The pro-choice side of the debate takes on the medical argument strong, and they would say, listen, abortion today is relatively safe, and it is in many cases far less dangerous than allowing the pregnancy to continue. Psychological well-being is not something to be lightly brushed aside. It's a serious argument that needs to be thoughtfully and compassionately considered. This argument would continue that the only dangerous abortions are either self-induced abortions or those that were performed by unqualified personnel in unsanitary conditions, times when abortions were not legal. Again, the case I was referring to, which is Dr. Harold Gosnell, has kind of shown us that that's not true. Some abortion facilities are not sanitary, and the abortions performed there, even by doctors, are not safe. Interestingly, efforts made in some states to ensure that they are have been fought by those on the pro-choice side of the debate, because they have viewed these as a backdoor method of limiting a woman's access to an abortion. But the argument continues that abortions are much safer, especially in the early stages of pregnancy, when most of the abortions are indeed performed, than going through a full 9 months of pregnancy. There would be those who would argue the other side of that, but this is a strong argument made by those on the pro-choice side of the ledger. In answer to those on the pro-life side who talk about guilt after an abortion, those on the pro-choice side would say, yeah, you're right, some women may feel guilty, but not all women do. And that is because not all women would consider that conceptus to be a human being and worthy of the respect afforded to those we do consider human beings. And so why should the fact that some women feel guilty, probably as a result of their social background, why should that guilt that they feel mean that those who would not have such guilt have a restriction placed on their reproductive freedom? And furthermore, the life of someone already born, the woman, should take precedence over the life of an unborn conceptus. Now, of course, this is a denial of the sanctity argument. It would at least be a variation of it, would say, okay, life is sacred, we will give you that. But where do you get this idea that an unborn life, that life should have the higher status than the life of the woman carrying that unborn human being? Isn't that person already born of higher value? And therefore, isn't her life more sacred? So, response to the sacred argument. Of course, there is this emotional issue with rape and incest pregnancies. We talked about that. And so almost always when there is a debate between someone on the pro-life side, someone on the pro-choice side, the pro-choice person is going to go very quickly to the rape and incest, because they know that the emotional power of that argument is such that those listening to the debate are going to tend to gravitate towards their side of the issue. Rape and incest are indeed two of the most serious crimes that can be committed against a woman. And the argument is that under no circumstances should a victim be forced to endure an unwanted pregnancy resulting from either of these actions committed against them. Now, there are variations. Some pro-lifers would say, okay, under a self-defense doctrine, we will accept that. And would you agree with us then to ban the rest? And you'll find quite quickly, when that argument is used, that there is no willingness to do that. This is the head of a spear, and it's a very effective one. It's a very sharp one. It's a hard argument to answer because we look at with horror at these particular crimes, and we do naturally feel compassion for any woman who would find herself with an unplanned pregnancy as a result of either of these crimes committed against her. The responsibility argument raised by the pro-life side of the debate is turned on its head by those on the pro-choice side. They would say, responsibility? Men don't have to be responsible. It's unfair. It's unequal. This is why it's a feminist issue. The man often skates. They take no responsibility whatsoever. And the fact is that the woman is left with a huge responsibility. No one else has to go through the pregnancy other than the woman. And then they have to devote 18 or more years to raising a child they didn't want. Therefore, the argument goes, the final decision to go through with the pregnancy must be with the woman, and it must be her decision alone, because she is the one who has to have the child, has to be pregnant, has to go through all that. The man doesn't. The man skates. And that is fundamentally unfair. It goes back to that idea that this is an accident of nature. And again, viva the accident, or none of us would be here. But she says, no. We're not talking about that where a husband and wife would agree we want to have kids. We're talking about an unwanted pregnancy here. And you're saying a woman should go ahead and carry that child to term. That's not fair. Say, well, the man's going to have to pay financial support. Big deal. Who's going to have the bulk of the work here, honestly? Because we live in a society where women have to grow up, but little boys never do. Or in many cases, they never do. So they would say, men get to be irresponsible. Why should we have all the responsibility dumped on us? Now, after considering the arguments on both sides of the debate, the authors of our textbook offer a more moderate position. They suggest, as they do with a lot of moral problems, that why don't we have a synthesis here, where each side gets some of what they want, but neither side gets everything that they want. And they propose that this synthesis look like a position on the issue advocated by someone we referred to earlier, Daniel Callahan. He's the one who coined the term conceptus. And he takes the developmental view of human life, very similar to the logic of Roe v. Wade. And this is his in-between argument. His view is that certainly conception is a big event. It determines the genetic basis for an individual human being. But he would agree with those on the other side of the debate by saying some degree of development is surely required before we can legitimately speak of a conceptus as a full-fledged individual human being. He also suggests that doctors and nurses not be forced to perform or participate in abortions if it would go against their personal moral conscience, that they are perfectly justified in refusing to have any part of an abortion at any stage of a pregnancy. Let's say, for example, you were a Roman Catholic doctor and you were a practicing Catholic committed to the teaching of your church. Performing an abortion, according to Catholic doctrine, would be a mortal sin. That's one of those things that you go directly to hell for. And so if you force a doctor to do this, as by the way some countries in Europe are now proposing, then you're saying, doctor, we're giving you a choice here. You can continue to practice your soul, or you can damn your eternal soul. Not a good choice when you think about it. So Callahan suggests that there be an exception for conscience. Now, this goes against our author's freedom principle because that would be or could be seen as a moral judgment against a woman who is choosing to have an abortion. But Callahan suggests that it is an exception worth making for tolerance reasons, that you tolerate the fact that there are people with strongly held religious convictions on this particular issue. The author says it's possible to take those two principles that we've just referred to and develop a synthesis. He says the reason for this is, in fact, pro-life is not really pro-life and pro-choice is really not pro-choice. That most people actually have a mixed view on the issue. Earlier he said the debate is being driven by the extremes, but when you actually poll people and find out what they believe on the abortion issue, you find out that they're somewhere in the middle. Let me illustrate this. What we have here is a line that shows the spectrum of opinion on the abortion issue. Far left there you have the ultimate pro-lifer. No abortion for any reason. Tubular pregnancy, the woman's going to die. The fetus will never develop. Tough toenails. Must be tough being you. No exception. At the other end of the spectrum, we have actually where our law is at right now. Any reason throughout the entire pregnancy. Most people are not standing at either one of those extremes. Most people, as you begin to slide your hand along the timeline, a life of the woman, most people would say, yeah, if the woman is going to lose her life as a result of this pregnancy, that tubular pregnancy, the right of self-defense kicks in. Rape and incest, some would say, yeah, I see that as a right of self-defense. Severe deformity, you're going to lose a few now. People are saying, well, do we really want to abort children with Down syndrome? We're getting a little bit like National Socialism there. You go on any reason during the first trimester, that is the European position. Most people are probably comfortable with the European position on this issue. Any reason for the second trimester, most people would begin to say, nah, I don't think so. Any reason throughout the entire pregnancy, very few people are there. And so the authors of our textbook are suggesting that maybe we could reach some middle ground here. The extremes would not be happy. The ultimate pro-lifer wouldn't be happy. The ultimate pro-choicer would not be happy. But most people would probably be more comfortable with something such as they have in Europe than what we have now. In fact, most people aren't even aware of what we have now. And so in a society with a lot of different opinions, for instance, my opinion, I would be probably life of the woman would be where I would be standing on that spectrum. And it's based on my religious beliefs, but not everyone goes to my church. So can my religious beliefs be the basis of public policy in a country as diverse as this? Am I comfortable with the law being somewhere else? No, I don't get everything I want. But maybe a synthesis is the best we can do. The author offers that as a theory, as a suggestion. What do you think? Where are you on this spectrum?